It was supposed to be a typical day at the precinct, the kind where officers went about their routines handling reports, taking calls, and maintaining order, but Officer Jake Connors couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the precinct felt thicker that morning, and he couldn't pinpoint why the rumors of Sarah Mitchell's upcoming promotion had been circulating for weeks now. And though Connors had always kept a low profile when it came to gossip, he couldn't ignore how the talks about her advancement had started to affect the atmosphere. He had been with the department for nearly 2 decades, and for all his years of service, he had never been promoted to a position of higher rank. He watched as younger officers moved up the ladder one by one each time, feeling like a silent observer of a game he never seemed to be invited to play. The department had changed over the years, and so had Connors, but what never changed was his frustration with the system, the way it worked, the way it rewarded those who played the game, the way it always felt like no matter how hard he worked, he was still an outsider when it came to real influence. Connors wasn't the type to openly express discontent, at least not until today, as he sat at the table with Alt Mitchell and a few other senior officers discussing the future direction of the department. The conversation had started calmly enough, but it wasn't long before it began to escalate. Mitchell was giving her usual detailed breakdown of how she wanted things to improve, focusing on policies and procedures. Connors, however, couldn't hold back any longer. The words were spilling out before he could stop them. He questioned her decisions, pointed out flaws in her logic, and challenged her approach. It wasn't the first time they had clashed, but today felt different. There was something in the air today that made everything feel more personal. Mitchell tried to keep her composure, but the sharpness in Connor's tone was unmistakable. His frustration was visible to everyone in the room, and with each passing second, it became harder for him to contain it. The more Mitchell tried to explain the reasoning behind her ideas, the more Connors dug in his heels. And as the argument reached its peak, something snapped inside of him. In a moment of sheer impulse, Connors leaned forward and spat in Mitchell's direction. It wasn't just an angry gesture. It was a statement, a way to show her that he would not back down, no matter the cost. The room went silent. As the spit landed on the floor between them, no one moved for a moment. Time seemed to stand still. And then the chaos broke out. Officers in the room quickly reacted. Some moved to intervene, while others stood frozen in disbelief. Connors stood there breathless, not knowing what had just happened and feeling a wave of regret and confusion wash over him. But there was no turning back now. And as Mitchell slowly wiped her face, her expression unreadable, Connors knew that this moment would change everything for both of them. The consequences would follow, but neither of them could have imagined just how far this would go. The tension in the room lingered long after the incident was over. Everyone knew things wouldn't be the same, and Connors knew he had crossed the line that might cost him everything. The immediate aftermath of the incident left the precinct in shock as officers slowly processed what had just happened. The silence that followed the confrontation was almost suffocating. Alt Mitchell stood motionless for a moment before taking a deep breath and gathering herself. The spit had not hit her directly, but the gesture alone had been enough to send a clear message. It was a challenge. It was an assault on her authority, something that cut deeper than any physical wound. Connors was immediately escorted out of the room and placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation. The officers who had witnessed the altercation exchanged uneasy glances, some unsure of how to react, others unsure of what to think. The precinct had always prided itself on its unity, but this moment felt like a crack in that foundation. Mitchell had been the one to step in and take control of the department's future, but now she had to manage the fallout from this incident while keeping her composure in front of her colleagues. It was no easy task as she stood there facing her fellow officers. Mitchell could feel the weight of their eyes on her, some filled with sympathy, some with doubt, but none with the clarity of what was to come. She knew that many in the precinct respected her for her career achievements and dedication, but others had never fully accepted her rise through the ranks. Mitchell had always been the quiet observer, the one who worked behind the scenes to make things happen, but now she was in the spotlight, and this moment threatened to undermine everything she had worked for. The officers slowly returned to their desks, but the atmosphere had changed. The usual hum of activity seemed muted as people whispered and avoided eye contact with one another. Mitchell knew the investigation would be the first test of her leadership. She had to ensure that it was handled fairly and without bias, but she also had to consider the emotional toll it had taken on her personally. As an officer, she had been trained to handle the pressures of the job. But as a woman in a male-dominated field, she was constantly reminded of the extra scrutiny she faced in every decision she made. Connors had been a respected officer in the department for years, though his approach to leadership had been more traditional and at times outdated. His commitment to the job had never been questioned. It was this very loyalty that made what had happened so complicated. Mitchell couldn't simply ignore his years of service. Yet she also couldn't overlook what had just transpired. There was a line between professional disagreement and disrespect, and Connors had crossed it in a way that could not be ignored. Mitchell took a deep breath as she sat at her desk and began to make notes for the upcoming internal investigation. She would have to give a full statement recounting the events that had led to the altercation. She would have to answer questions from internal affairs and potentially face pressure from both her colleagues and the public, but she had already decided that she wouldn't back down. She couldn't let this incident define her or the department. No matter how difficult it was to confront the reality of the situation, Mitchell had a job to do, and she would do it with the same integrity and resolve that had brought her this far. But deep down, she knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Connors was not just a colleague to her. He was someone who had been part of her professional journey, and that made this personal for both of them. The damage was done. Now it was time to deal with the consequences. As the days passed, the precinct remained in a state of uneasy anticipation. The internal investigation was now underway, and Officer Connors was placed on administrative leave pending the results. The gravity of his actions had cast a long shadow over the department, and officers who had once seen him as a trusted colleague now found themselves questioning his judgment. The department was accustomed to handling tension and disagreements, but nothing had prepared anyone for the intensity of the situation. Connors had always been known for his stubbornness, his refusal to back down from a stance, but this was different. It wasn't just a bad decision, it was an outburst that left everyone questioning his character. Lieutenant Mitchell, for her part, knew she had to be the steady hand in the storm. Despite the personal hurt she felt from the incident, she kept a professional exterior, determined to ensure that the investigation was as fair as possible. She had been in the department long enough to understand how quickly rumors spread, how easily a narrative could be spun. She needed to make sure the facts of the incident were clearly documented, but she also had to manage the growing division within the precinct. Some officers, though shocked by Connors' actions, saw it as a moment of weakness, a slip in judgment that could be forgiven with time. Others, particularly those who had long been critical of his abrasive style, felt he had crossed an unspoken line that should not be overlooked. Mitchell sat in the quiet of her office, reading through her notes, preparing herself for the questions that were sure to come. She knew that this would be a pivotal moment in her career. The way she handled this would shape not just her leadership, but the future of the department. If she showed any sign of weakness, it would be seen as a failure, a sign that she couldn't handle the pressure. If she came down too hard on Connors, she risked alienating those who still saw him as a reliable officer. It was a delicate balancing act. Meanwhile, Connors sat at home, his world unraveling. The suspension was a blow to his sense of identity. He had spent years building his reputation as a loyal officer, and now, in one impulsive moment, it felt like everything had been taken from him. He knew that what he had done was wrong, but he didn't fully understand how to fix it. He hadn't meant for things to escalate so quickly. He had been frustrated, yes, but it wasn't just about the promotion. It was about the way the department had changed over the years, how the old guard was being replaced by a new generation that seemed to dismiss the very values he had once fought for. Connors spent hours reflecting on his actions, replaying the argument over and over in his mind. He knew he owed Mitchell an apology, but that wasn't enough to make up for what had happened. There was no easy way to repair the damage. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear. If he was to have any chance of redemption, he would need to face the consequences head-on. Lieutenant Mitchell was called in for her formal statement the next morning. As she walked into the room with internal affairs, she felt a familiar sense of calm wash over her. This wasn't the first time she had been involved in a tense investigation. but it was the first time she felt so personally invested. She would recount the events as clearly as possible, but deep down she knew this was more than just a procedural matter. It was about the future of her leadership. As the questions began, Mitchell's professionalism shone through. She explained the circumstances leading up to the confrontation, her decision to remain composed in the face of disrespect, and the emotional toll it had taken on her. But she also made it clear that Connor's actions had crossed a line that could not be ignored, and the department had to address it with the seriousness it deserved. The investigation would take time, but the path forward was already beginning to take shape. The choices made now would ripple through the precinct, shaping the department's future for years to come. As the days dragged on, the tension within the precinct only grew more palpable. The investigation into the incident had become the central focus, consuming everyone's attention. Officers who had once exchanged greetings in the hallways now avoided one another, unsure of where loyalties lay. Those who had supported Connors were finding themselves caught between defending a longtime colleague and grappling with the seriousness of his actions. Meanwhile, those who had never fully agreed with his approach to policing saw this as the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that would expose the flaws they had long believed existed beneath his surface. Lieutenant Mitchell, meanwhile, was trying to hold everything together, managing the fractured atmosphere within the department. She continued to meet with officers, listening to their concerns, but it was becoming clear that the rift was deepening. Some officers expressed their disappointment in Connor's actions, feeling betrayed by his inability to maintain professionalism, while others quietly hinted that Mitchell might have handled the situation differently. No one said it directly, but the subtle hints were there. Doubts about her ability to lead were starting to surface, and it was clear the division was no longer just between Connors and Mitchell, but between her and her fellow officers. Mitchell was no stranger to adversity, but this felt different. As the investigation unfolded, she had expected some pushback from her colleagues, but she hadn't anticipated the growing resentment that seemed to be building in every corner of the precinct. No matter what she did, it seemed that she couldn't win. Every decision she made was scrutinized, from the way she handled the internal investigation to how she managed the day-to-day operations of the department. The weight of her future as the department's new head was growing heavier with each passing day, and she couldn't afford to make another misstep. But it wasn't just the officers that were turning against her. It was the public, too. News outlets picked up the story, adding fuel to the fire. The community, which had always looked to the police for a sense of security, now found itself questioning the integrity of the department. The public fallout was swift and unforgiving. Social media exploded with debates, with some defending Connors as a man who had given years of service to the force, while others condemned his actions as emblematic of a larger culture of disrespect within law enforcement. The once proud precinct now seemed like a target, its reputation hanging in the balance. Amid the turmoil, Officer Connors was facing his own personal reckoning. He had been placed on suspension, unable to even step foot on the grounds of the precinct as the investigation unfolded. He spent his days alone, reflecting on what had happened, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. He knew he had acted out of frustration, but the deeper issue was one of a growing sense of betrayal. He had given so much of his life to this department, but it felt like he had been pushed to the margins as new faces and new ideas began to take over. Lieutenant Mitchell's rise to power had only highlighted the growing divide between him and the department he once believed in. He didn't want to believe it, but a small part of him knew that this was the end of the road. Still, Connors couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had to do something. He couldn't just let this moment define him, not after everything he had given to the force. He owed it to himself and to the department to make things right. But how could he? The damage had already been done. His reputation had been tarnished, and Mitchell's leadership was now being questioned in ways he had never imagined. As the days ticked by, the internal investigation continued, with no clear end in sight. The division within the precinct remained, and Connors knew that whatever the outcome, the fallout would be far-reaching. Mitchell remained focused on leading the department, but it was becoming clear that she couldn't fix this alone. The future of the department depended on the decisions that would be made in the coming days, and on how both Connors and Mitchell would navigate the difficult road ahead. As the investigation continued, tensions at the precinct reached a boiling point. Lieutenant Mitchell had hoped that the storm would eventually pass, but the situation was only escalating. The department was now split down the middle, with many officers openly questioning her ability to lead. Some believed that she was too quick to act, that Connors deserved more understanding for his years of service, while others thought she wasn't doing enough to show that the department wouldn't tolerate the kind of behavior he had displayed. It was a classic divide between the old guard and the new leadership, and it was threatening to tear the precinct apart. Mitchell, though still determined, could feel her confidence beginning to waver. She had always prided herself on making tough decisions, but nothing had prepared her for the depth of this crisis. She was torn between protecting the department's integrity and her belief that Connors, despite his actions, had earned some level of respect. But her duty was clear: to uphold the rules of the department, to ensure that all officers, no matter their rank, adhered to the standards of professionalism expected in law enforcement. Despite the mounting pressure, Mitchell took action, calling for a department-wide meeting to address the ongoing tensions. She needed to lay everything out on the table. The public outcry, the divided officers, the damage to the department's reputation, it all had to be confronted. As she prepared for the meeting, she could feel the weight of every decision, every word that would come from her mouth. This was not just about Connors anymore. It was about the future of the department. It was about whether she could hold things together long enough to guide the precinct through the storm. Connors, on the other hand, was sinking deeper into his own sense of isolation. He had avoided the precinct as much as possible, staying holed up in his apartment, unable to face his colleagues or confront the consequences of his actions. His pride had been wounded, but the deeper pain was the sense that he no longer belonged in a place that had once felt like family. As the days dragged on, he began to realize that there was no way to undo what he had done. The spit, his outburst, had marked a turning point, and nothing would erase it. The department that had once valued his dedication now viewed him with suspicion and disappointment. But still, a part of him was not ready to give up. Connors knew that if he wanted any chance of repairing the damage, he would need to face Mitchell directly. He had avoided her ever since the incident, but there was no longer any excuse. He owed her an apology, and he needed to take responsibility for the moment that had torn everything apart. He knew that she was facing a difficult position as well. She had tried to do things the right way, to rise through the ranks based on merit, but the divisions within the department made it harder than anyone had expected. The day of the department meeting arrived, and the mood at the precinct was tense. Officers gathered in the main conference room, murmuring in hushed tones, exchanging wary glances. The tension in the room was almost tangible, as if everyone was bracing for a confrontation. Mitchell stood at the front, facing the crowd, her posture straight and unwavering. She knew what was coming. She knew that whatever she said would be dissected and debated, but there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, she began to speak. "I'm sure you all know why we're here today," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "The events that took place between Officer Connors and myself were unacceptable, and we're here to discuss the consequences, both for him and for all of us. This department has always prided itself on professionalism, and we cannot let one act of disrespect undermine everything we've worked for." She paused, scanning the room, her eyes locking with several officers. "We will not tolerate behavior that threatens the integrity of this force. However, I also believe in fairness. We all make mistakes, but we must own them and learn from them. I'm not asking for you to forgive or forget what happened. I'm asking for us to come together and find a way forward." The room was silent, but the tension was palpable. The officers were listening, but no one knew what would come next. Would Connors be given another chance? Or would this be the end of his career? The room remained silent after Lieutenant Mitchell's words, and for a moment, it felt like the entire department was holding its breath. Every officer was processing the weight of her statement in their own way, unsure of how to react. Mitchell's tone had been firm, but there was a softness to her message, a desire for understanding, for growth, for moving forward. Yet beneath that, She knew the tension in the room was still thick, and that it wouldn't be resolved easily. The rift was too deep, the emotions too raw. Mitchell continued, her voice steady despite the pressure. We've all faced difficult moments, times when we've made choices we regret. The difference now is how we move forward. We're not just a department, we're a team. We need to decide if we can repair the damage and rebuild, or if this will be the breaking point. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Officer Connors, who had been sitting in the back, noticeably absent from the meeting until now. His presence in the room caused a ripple of whispers, and the officers around him shifted uncomfortably. Connors hadn't spoken a word since the incident, and many were eager to hear what he would say, though they were unsure of what that might be. He had been the focal point of the department's division, and now, finally, he was here to face the consequences. The room fell into an even more profound silence as Connors stood slowly, his expression a mix of guilt and determination. He didn't look at anyone in particular, but he could feel their eyes on him, weighing his every movement. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, Connors began, his voice a bit rough. I know I crossed the line, and I know that no matter how much I try to explain my frustration, it doesn't excuse my behavior. What I did was disrespectful, not just to Lieutenant Mitchell, but to all of you. I've been part of this department for a long time, and I've always believed in the mission of this force. But I let my emotions get the best of me, and that's on me. The room was still, everyone hanging on his every word. Connors paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts before continuing. I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I did was inexcusable, but I want to make it right. I want to do whatever it takes to rebuild trust with you all. I'm not proud of what happened, and I'm ready to face whatever consequences come from it. I just want to make sure that, in the end, this department remains united. We've always worked together, and I don't want to be the reason that changes. His words were met with mixed reactions. Some officers nodded quietly, recognizing the sincerity in his voice, while others remained stony-faced, still unsure of how they felt. Mitchell watched him carefully, processing his apology. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing that Connors had to take responsibility for his actions, but the way he carried himself in that moment, vulnerable yet sincere, spoke volumes. Thank you, Officer Connors, Mitchell said, her voice steady but softer than before. That's what I needed to hear, and I think it's what the department needs to hear too. The path forward isn't going to be easy, but we're all in this together. With those words, Mitchell felt the weight of the meeting begin to lift just slightly. There was still much to be done, but she knew that Connor's apology, though far from the end of the matter, was a significant step in the right direction. The officers in the room began to shift, their body language less tense, some even nodding in agreement. But others, still unsure, remained quiet, watching to see what would come next. Would Connors truly change? Could the department heal? We have a lot of work ahead of us, Mitchell continued. But I believe that this department can recover from this. We faced challenges before, and we can face this one. The question is whether we're willing to learn from this experience and grow stronger because of it. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. Mitchell's words had planted a seed of hope, and Connor's apology had begun to open the door to healing. Yet deep down, both of them knew that the journey to restore the department's unity would be a long and difficult one. There would be lingering questions, lingering doubts, and moments where the past would resurface. But in that room, for the first time since the incident, there was a sense of possibility, of moving forward, of rebuilding what had been broken. The weeks following the department meeting were filled with tension and uncertainty, but there was also a glimmer of hope. Lieutenant Mitchell's decision to allow Connors a chance to redeem himself had sparked mixed feelings, but it had also begun to break through the walls of division. Some officers were still unsure, reluctant to forgive so quickly, while others appreciated the opportunity to move forward. But despite the fractured trust, the department had no choice but to work together. The investigation continued, and the long process of repairing the damage had only just begun. Mitchell had been keeping a close eye on Connors. She had seen the genuine remorse in his eyes during the meeting, but she knew that actions spoke louder than words. There was no quick fix for the damage caused by his outburst, and no matter how sincere his apology, time would tell whether he could rebuild the relationships he had jeopardized. For now, Connors had returned to light duty, working under close supervision while awaiting the final decision on his fate. It was a delicate balance. Mitchell didn't want to let his actions slide, but she also didn't want to rush to judgment. The department needed to know that there were consequences, but they also needed to see that redemption was possible. Connors himself was struggling with his place in the department. He had always been one of the veterans, the steady presence that younger officers could rely on, but now he felt like an outsider. His colleagues were cordial, but there was a distance that hadn't existed before. Conversations had become more formal, the camaraderie once shared now replaced by careful professionalism. Connors found himself wondering if he could ever return to the team he had once been a central part of. He didn't regret apologizing, but the weight of his actions continued to haunt him. Every time an officer walked past him without saying a word, he felt the sting of his own mistake. As days turned into weeks, Mitchell could see the changes in Connors, too. He was no longer the same confident, respected officer he had once been. There was a new humility in him, a willingness to listen, to learn that hadn't been there before. She had always known Connors to be a hard worker, but now he seemed more introspective, more careful in his interactions. It was clear he was trying to prove himself again, but Mitchell wondered if it would be enough. One day, during a shift change, Mitchell walked into the briefing room to find Connors alone, sitting in a chair with his head bowed. He had been quiet in recent weeks, focused on the task at hand, but now there was a heaviness in the air. She approached him, sensing that something was on his mind. "You okay, Connors?" she asked, her voice soft yet steady. Connors looked up, his face etched with fatigue. "I don't know, Lieutenant," he replied quietly. "I'm trying to do what's right, but it feels like I'll never earn back the trust I lost. I made a mistake, and now I'm not sure how to fix it." Mitchell sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "It's going to take time. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight, but it's not impossible. You're here, you're showing up, and you're putting in the effort. That's all anyone can ask for." Connors nodded, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "I just hate that I've become this guy, the one everyone looks at and wonders if he's really changed." Mitchell leaned forward, her gaze direct. "You can't control how others see you. What matters is how you see yourself. If you're truly committed to proving you can do better, that will speak louder than anything else. But it's not about perfection, it's about progress." For a moment, Connors was silent, absorbing her words. He knew she was right. His journey to redemption wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be quick, but it was the only path forward. He had already lost his reputation, but there was a chance, if he worked hard enough, to rebuild it. Back at the precinct, the effects of the incident continued to ripple through the department. While some officers had begun to accept Connors' apology and reestablish their working relationships with him, others remained skeptical. Still, the department carried on, doing its job, though it was clear that the events of the past weeks had shaken the foundation. The healing process would take time, but Mitchell was beginning to feel that, with patience and the right leadership, the department could move past this. The real test was still to come. Would Connors prove that he had truly changed? Could Mitchell continue to hold the department together, despite the cracks that were still visible? Only time would tell, but as both Connors and Mitchell moved forward, they knew that the path ahead was filled with challenges and opportunities for growth. They had come this far, but the journey was far from over. Months passed, and the department continued to grapple with the aftershocks of the incident. The road to recovery was slower than anyone had anticipated, but there were signs that things were improving. Lieutenant Mitchell had managed to keep a steady hand on the department, though she knew the underlying tensions were still there. Connors had worked hard to prove that his outburst was a momentary lapse, and while he had regained some respect, there was still a sense of wariness among his peers. Connors' efforts were undeniable, though. He showed up early, stayed late, and worked tirelessly on cases that had long been neglected. His focus had sharpened, and his professionalism, once questioned, was now consistently on display. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to earn it, not just from Mitchell, but from every officer who had been affected by his actions. There were still moments of awkwardness when officers passed by without speaking, but Connors had learned to deal with it. He focused on what he could control: the work, the dedication, the small victories that were slowly but surely restoring his place in the precinct. Mitchell, too, had her own battles to fight. While she had held the department together during the crisis, the true test was whether she could lead it into the future without the shadow of the past looming over her. The support she had once counted on from her colleagues was fractured, and every decision she made now carried the weight of suspicion. But Mitchell remained steadfast. She had made mistakes in the past, and she knew that this situation was no different. But where some saw weakness in her willingness to forgive, others began to see strength. She had shown the department that leadership was not about perfection. It was about navigating the hard moments with integrity. One day, as the sun began to set and the precinct began to empty for the evening, Mitchell sat in her office, reviewing case files. She had made a point of keeping her door open, offering a space for officers to come and talk, whether about cases or personal matters. As she looked over the paperwork in front of her, she heard a knock on the door. "Come in," she called, looking up. It was Connors, standing in the doorway, his posture different from the man she had seen months ago. He was no longer the officer who had walked into her office with a chip on his shoulder, ready to defy her. Instead, he was the officer who had been through the fire, a man who had learned from his mistakes and was now ready to face the future. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, stepping inside, "can we talk?" Mitchell set the papers aside, her gaze softening. "Of course, Connors. What's on your mind?" He took a breath, pausing as if choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to thank you for giving me a second chance. I know it hasn't been easy, and I know that I'm still earning my place back, but I don't take this lightly. I appreciate that you didn't just throw me out after what I did. I don't deserve it, but I'm going to make sure that I earn it." Mitchell nodded, her eyes meeting his with understanding. "I know you're working hard, and I can see that you're trying. But don't forget, this department needs more than just hard work. It needs leadership, integrity, and respect. And you've got a long way to go before you truly rebuild that. But you're on the right path." Connors stood taller at her words, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in a long while. "I know, and I'll keep working for it, one step at a time." The two shared a brief moment of mutual understanding. There were no grand gestures, no grand proclamations, but in that small moment, Connors knew he had made progress. Mitchell had been right all along. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, about learning from the past and striving for something better. As the months wore on, Connors continued to rebuild his reputation within the department. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but his dedication to improvement became undeniable. Some officers began to welcome him back into the fold, and others remained cautious, but the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The incident, while not forgotten, had begun to feel like a distant memory. The department was no longer defined by what had happened, but by what it could accomplish moving forward. Mitchell's leadership was now fully cemented. She had weathered the storm and come out stronger, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of resilience. The department, once fractured, was slowly but surely healing, and as she looked around at the officers she now worked with, Mitchell knew that the work was far from over, but it was work worth doing. They had learned from the past, and they would carry those lessons with them into the future, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, it was clear the department was finally ready to move on.